Chapter 2, the unique role of miracles in the Old Testament. Take the bait. I will admit I'm not a big fishing fan. To spend all day waiting for a fish to take the bait, to me, it's just boring. One of the keys in fishing is to have the proper bait. If a fish doesn't take the bait, you won't catch the fish. Taking the bait is kind of like a trap, and you lure somebody in by a specific action or emotional response. And cessationism, when they define the purpose of miracles, is the bait to lure you into their belief system. Just because they might show something from the Bible that you didn't know doesn't mean their conclusions are correct. I must have watched the Ten Commandments about a half a dozen times. I can remember some of the quotes, "So let it be written, so let it be done," or "Let my people go." I can't imagine how crazy it must have been to see the Red Sea open and the children of Israel cross on dry ground. It was a well-done movie, but think, what was the purpose of those miracles? Was it primarily done to validate Moses as a messenger of new revelation, or was there more to those miracles? God not only brought judgment on the gods of Egypt, but he called out a people unto himself. That is something that cessationists do not give the proper attention to. The miracles are not supposed to focus on man, but on God's purpose. Important. The very foundation of cessationism relies on the premise that the primary role of miracles was to validate the messenger of God with new revelation. So don't take the bait, but let the scriptures guide you. Quote, "Scripture records only 3 brief periods in which God worked miracles through uniquely gifted men," end quote. So should one reduce miracles down to fit their own reasoning? Or should the text define the purpose of every miracle? Again, the primary purpose of miracles, according to Pastor Tom, was to validate the messenger of God with new revelation. So in his mind, once those very unique gifted men with a very unique purpose in only 3 unique time slots have been fulfilled, then the framework for cessationism has been built. Now, he will admit that God did and continues to do miracles, but God will choose to no longer use uniquely gifted men to do them. But what verse in the entire Bible states that God will no longer do miracles by men and women that are created in the very image of God? Has the purpose of miracles been fulfilled? And now there is no more a need for a human agent to do miracles. It may sound logical, but is it biblical? Can this type of reasoning reduce the glory and splendor of God down to that which man determines and not what the scriptures teach? Should not the text determine the meaning of every miracle and not cessationists? Quote, next he says, many charismatics believe miracles literally the pages of the Old Testament. Now, I don't think that's the best choice of words in my opinion, but I'll keep it at that. Not only were there miracles that recorded, but also some that were not recorded. Jeremiah 32:20, which has said signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, even unto this day, and in Israel, and among other men, and has made a name as at this day. Quote, but the biblical evidence is that there were only 2 periods in the Old Testament history when God worked miracles through uniquely gifted men, the time of Moses and Joshua, and Elijah and Elijah. To be clear, there are other occasions when God worked miracles directly without using any human agent. but they are far fewer than the miracles worked through human agents. End quote. I would challenge all cessationists to examine every miracle in the scriptures, then ponder on what was its purpose according to the text. In fact, I was able to see a principle in each of the healings of Jesus. To me, it seems out of character for God would only work miracles to authenticate a messenger with new revelation. The fact that we breathe is a miracle, and I believe there's a lot more to God than what cessationists give him credit for. Well, there is a significant difference between God working a miracle himself versus giving a human power to work miracles, end quote. Now, he'll go over the two periods in the Old Testament where God worked miracles through a human agent. First, there was Moses, and he did a number of miracles that would show the nation of Israel that God had picked Moses as their deliverer. Moses would enact the law of God known as the law of Moses. Moses' successor was Joshua, who also had his share of miracles. Quote, Joshua's ministry also was accompanied by miracles. The disruption of the waters of Jordan River, Joshua chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. The destruction of the city of Jericho, Joshua chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. But how was that any different than Gideon and what he did? This was a miracle through Joshua. Well, what about the victory of Gideon? Should Gideon be left out because he did not fit Pastor Tom's old premise? Gideon's miracle was not for the validation of himself, but was given to defeat the very enemies of Israel. Now back to the miracles of Joshua. Quote, and the sun standing still, Joshua chapter 10, verses 1 through 15. Joshua even had a unique encounter with the pre-incarnate Christ, Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. Abraham and Jacob had encounters that were more in number than Joshua. Each visitation had its own purpose. Joshua was around miracles. There is no question about that. But you be the judge concerning the case for miracles, working through him as uniquely gifted man. I'm not fully convinced he fits Pastor Tom's own premise. This period of Moses and Joshua is said to be about 65 years. Though God did miracles through Moses and others, the key to remember is God's character is to show himself strong. 2 Chronicles 16:9. Well, look at Elijah. As with Moses and Joshua, Elijah's miracles confirmed that he was a prophet of God set to communicate new revelation, end quote. The point to remember in all the prophets of the Old Testament had the potential to communicate new revelation. Yet if these miracles were primarily given to confirm God's messenger, then something doesn't add up. I am fully aware of the challenge of the false prophets of Baal, and that would show that Elijah was God's messenger. But God's messengers that gave out new revelation could not be only just 4 in the Old Testament. Hello? What about all the other Old Testament prophets that brought forth new revelation, but did not have the same type of miracles? The book of Hebrews speaks of those of faith that were a part of miracles besides the 4 Pastor Tom covers. Notice some of these miracles were done through a human agent, not because they were uniquely gifted, but wait for it, it was by faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 33 through 35. Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again. Notice that's faith, folks. And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Okay, now let's look at Elijah. As far as his successor, Elijah, he did even more miracles. Next, Pastor Tom begins to give the reason for all these special miracles. Quote, the primary purpose of miracles has always been to confirm the credentials of a divinely appointed messenger, to establish genuine prophet who speaks for God. He goes on to say, a period of miracles is always a time when special testimony is needed to confirm authenticity of God's prophets. End quote. So that time period was also about 65 years. Quote, God here defines the nature of a true prophet. Aaron, as Moses' prophet, wasn't allowed to speak for himself. He was to speak only the words of Moses, who was as God to him. That's what it means to be a prophet. As God appointed Moses the first prophet, he defines the nature of a prophet as one who is God's mouthpiece, solely a channel of divine revelation, end quote. Actually, there's other men like Enoch and Abraham. They were prophets before Moses. Why go to Moses first? Even if one is to argue that Enoch and Abraham didn't do miracles like Moses, the fact is Moses was not the first of God's messengers, and thus his premise comes into question. Let's continue. Quote, miracles were a unique, rare means to authenticate God's prophets. They served as a visible, tangible witness that God had chosen certain men to be channels of his divine revelation, end quote. God did use miracles to validate some of his prophets, but not all. Have you considered John the Baptist was called the greatest prophet of all? And yet, what does the Bible say about the miracles of John the Baptist? The Bible says he did no miracle, John 10:41. So how does that fit into his premise? I would think if any prophet, it would be John the Baptist that would perform miracles, since he would have the call to point to Jesus as Israel's Messiah. Miracles are to accomplish God's purpose. The premise that God would do miracles through uniquely gifted men that brought forth new revelation cannot be applied to all prophets, but only a few. Why should anyone accept his premise if the majority of prophets that brought forth new revelation, including the greatest prophet of all, did no miracles? If one is going to state a premise, then I would think there should be some consistency to that premise, don't you? To state something is primary, which is to validate the messenger of God with new revelation. But in the scriptures, they're only the exception, meaning 4 men in the Old Testament. Then that premise is not the norm, but the exception. Should sound doctrine be built on the norm or the exception? Judge ye. It is said by many cessationists that the greatest miracle of all is when one becomes a true believer. That miracle comes through a human agent. When the gospel is preached to one, like the Apostle Paul stated in the book of Romans, if God can use any believer, man, woman, or child, then how can one say that the primary purpose of miracles has always been to confirm the credentials of a divinely appointed messenger to establish a genuine prophet who speaks for God? It surprises me that men with such limited knowledge can limit what God can do. My Bible tells me that God's ways are past finding out. It's not our place to limit his mighty works, but to give him glory for those works, and even greater for who he is. Before we go to the New Testament, I believe his very foundation is weak. If your premise is to validate a messenger with new revelation by a miracle, and most prophets in the Old Testament did not do miracles, then Houston, we have a problem. Next, let's go to the New Testament.